Welcome to everybody to this symposium, which is meant to be a discussion. We're going to start with Mark Lowcock, who's Permanent Secretary of the Department of International Development. He's going to speak for about 10 minutes, then we'll have a discussion of what he says. Helen will have the opportunity of the first word, and then we'll open the floor for more discussion. After he's finished, we're going to move to Professor Robert Wade. We've slightly changed the order because there was some thought that we might follow either bourgeois chronology or geographical structure and something or another, so just make it slightly more sense. So I hope that nobody has come solely to hear this Cameron will miss the afternoon session. We'll be speaking there on the second session. So without any further ado, I suggest we go straight to Mark.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for a chance to participate in this. I'm really pleased to have a chance, really, just to say three things, largely picking up the lecture that Helen made yesterday, which I thought was incredibly timely for a set of issues that governments round the globe are going to be getting to grips with, especially over the next 18 months. The first thing I want to say is really to welcome the introductory section of your lecture, where you flagged up to everybody the resonance of the Millennium Development Goal Framework, and you reminded everybody that the MDGs had proved a framework which has had traction and has contributed to a lot of progress. I'm going to labour this point a little bit because there's something about the human spirit which means that too often we do not pay enough attention to the things that have gone well or have been successes. Life, as a famous British politician once said, is primarily to be thought of as nasty, brutish and short. And in fact, over the last few decades, and motivated by the Millennium Development Goals, it has become a little bit less of all of those things. Just on nasty, in 1990, as a lot of you will know, the world set itself the goal of reducing by 1/2 the proportion of people living in the most extreme poverty, characterised as below $1.25 a day, and achieving that reduction by 2015. As the World Bank told us a few months ago, in fact, that target, which when it was set was thought to be a stretch target, was achieved 5 years earlier than the target date. On the brutish issue, the data, if you follow it, on the number of lives lost in warfare and battles shows you that since the end of the 1940s, roughly 1950, to about now, there's been a 90% reduction in lives lost in battles, because there's less conflict than there used to be. If you look at violence and conflict inside societies as well, you take, for example, the experience of the US, there's been according to the FBI, a 40% reduction in violent crime in the US over the last few decades. If you look also at many developing countries, there's been, this isn't as well understood, I don't think, also a significant reduction in social violence. Sao Paulo, a city lots of people associate with a lot of criminality and violence, has seen a 3/4 reduction in the murder rate over the last decade. Maybe the most important dimension of all of life is life expectancy. And since the late 1940s, since 1950 to 55, I think, to be precise on the period, average life expectancy across the planet has grown from 47 years to 67 years. Of course, it's grown in developed countries as well as developing countries, but the main improvement has been for the bottom end of the pyramid, those people, many of whom wouldn't previously have got past their 5th birthday and now consistently have a good expectation of getting to the back end of their 7th decade. The reason I labour this point a little bit and flag up the role the MDGs have played in motivating progress, especially in the poorest countries in the next 15 years, is because the world is about, over the next 18 months, to decide what the successor framework to the MDGs should be. UNDP are going to have a very important role in that process, which is one that will roll out through the United Nations system. I think the Secretary General is working on some plans to draw in ideas from others to contribute to the debate as well. The United Kingdom government certainly hopes to be part of that. But you know, the reason this is an important opportunity is because the MDGs, unlike many other frameworks of this sort that have been agreed historically in the UN and elsewhere, has turned out to have a lot of traction. If we can replace it with a successor framework which has the same amount of traction, that will be a good thing for the world. That's my first point. The second thing I want to welcome is the emphasis Helen put in her lecture last night on the concept of resilience, but in particular, the broad understanding of resilience that you set out. We in the Department for International Development have had a bit of a focus ourselves on resilience over the last 2 years or so, but it is fair to say that we've looked primarily at a relatively narrow area of it. Resilience, very, very important, but still narrow, related to humanitarian and natural resource disasters affecting and dramatically, adversely affecting the livelihoods of large numbers of people. Helen's concept of resilience, and it must be said that, your organisation has been on this case for a little while. Last year's UNDP annual report has as its strapline, resilient nations. So I applaud the fact you've been on this for a while and you set it out in a lot of detail yesterday. But your concept with a political dimension, an economic dimension, a demographic dimension, a technological dimension, as well as an environmental dimension, I think is welcome and an important contribution to the debate. There's two particular bits of it I would like to draw a bit more attention to, not least because of the role that UNDP has played on them and can play more on them. The first is about democratization. You touched a little bit yesterday on the role that UNDP plays, which we're happy to support in the electoral process. Places like Kenya getting ready for this year's elections, Guyana, Senegal recently. You could also have mentioned the role you played in places like DRC and Yemen, which are much earlier in their democratic journey, but nevertheless UNDP's role, I think, has been important. The point about these processes is not that they're perfect. They're far from perfect, but they are part of a journey. I have, over the last week or so, been reading, firstly, a biography by Douglas Hurd of Robert Peel, who was the Prime Minister in this country about 200 years ago, and then a biography of Clement Attlee, who was the Prime Minister here in the period from 1945 to 1951. Robert Peel, the first 2 times he was elected to Parliament, had his seat bought for him with cash by his father. 140 years later, in the Attlee government, the nature of democracy in this country was still such that certain people, not least people in this city and the city not far away where I was educated, were given 2 votes, not 1 vote. Now, it took us 140 years in this country to make all that progress and still not have completed our democratic journey. The surprising thing about the pace of democratization in most of the countries where Helen's organisation works and where we work is not how slow and difficult it is, but how fast and relatively successful it is. And UNDP is an accelerator of that process, and it's really important that we continue to support your work. The last thing I want to flag really is a point you also identified about the way in which resilience can be built and support can be provided to people in countries where the government and the elite are not interested in those at the bottom of the pile, bottom of the pyramid. And I think that you pointed out the example of the Oportunidades program in Mexico, which is a program which lots of middle-income countries, led by Mexico and Brazil, started to put in place 15 years or so ago, and is now being rolled out increasingly to the poorest countries. With the assistance of new technology, especially mobile telephony, it turns out that you can get economically empowering but still small sums of money to very large numbers of people who previously were unreached by the official system. I personally think this is one of the biggest breakthroughs in dealing with development problems in places where the government's not really interested in sections of the community, geographically or ethnically, or however you want to reach them. I think that had it not been the case that these cash transfer systems were put to work in the way they were in, for example, southern and western Ethiopia during the drought last year, in northern Kenya, and most crucially of all in al-Shabaab-controlled parts of Somalia, the ability of the international community to have protected large numbers of people from the most acute deprivation and the most acute human suffering in the way that we saw in earlier food crises in those regions would have been dramatically reduced. So I think that, again, UNDP's contribution, which we like to think we've also played a role in supporting DFID, to new ways of reaching the previously unreachable, is a very important additional dimension of your resilience concept. Thank you very much indeed.
I'll ask Helen first just to say a few words, and then we'll open up to more general discussion.
Should I? I'll use the mic. It's easier on the voice. Well, thank you, Mark, for the comments. And can I start by saying that UK DFID is one of the most important core funders of our organisation. And I mention that because I know there's a lot of pressure on countries, A, on development budgets, but B, also often a lot of pressure to have your own flag over everything. So the countries which will put into a bigger pond like UNDP, because it is capable of doing things beyond what bilateral programs can do under the UN flag and umbrella, is really appreciated. So thank you for that. And yes, look, the MDGs were not perfect. The way in which they were drawn up wasn't perfect, but with some strange chemistry, it worked. They were time-bound. They were specific. People knew what they were aiming at. They were embraced by developing countries and donor countries alike. And I think that focus did get results. So that brings us to a topic I'll touch on briefly tonight when I talk about the journey to Rio +20. And it is what replaces them, because the concept now seems to be to go to sustainable development goals, which will apply to all countries, Britain and New Zealand as much as Kenya and Guyana. Now, what will be important is not to lose the focus for developing countries in those broader goals. And secondly, it will be important not to lose the specificity, time-bound nature, because there's a lot of urgency out there. While we say the MDGs have in many ways been successful, remember that target of halving the number of people living in extreme poverty between 1990 and 2015 still left the other half in extreme poverty. So if you're in the half, the roughly 1 billion that probably will be lifted out of extreme poverty in the specified time frame, great. But if you're not, there's still work to be done for you. If your child is still the one who's never made primary school, there's work to do. And having said that we're close to getting every child in primary school, we're nowhere near close to having every child complete primary school or go on to secondary school. So, and one could go on the goals like that. So there is definitely unfinished business on this journey. And I think what's important for civil society and interested governments in the lead up to the debate at Rio and then beyond on the sort of framing of the Sustainable Development Goals is work to keep it focused. Because if your focus or goal is everything, you miss it every time. You don't know what you're aiming at. We really welcome British government's interest in the post-2015 framework design. The aim the Secretary-General has is to appoint a high-level panel to work on that, which the UN system would very much want to then get him behind, service and hope out of a very, very broad global conversation, which has to involve people, not just high-ups and experts, to set the next round of goals and really make them meaningful, easily communicable, and focused on getting results. Second point to pick up from Mark's comments around resilience. Yes, I've framed it quite broadly, because I think often we automatically think of resilience to natural disaster, but it's got all those other manifestations I talked about last night, resilience to shocks of all kinds. And I do strongly believe that the social protection frameworks you put in place do stop people sliding back irreversibly from bad shocks. And I think that was a lesson that the countries today we call developed did learn in the Great Depression. As I said last night, the horror of the Great Depression was that families who just sort of hauled themselves up a little bit down the ladder lost everything. You know, people who had never been without work lost work. You know, my mother as a child was sent with her younger sibling or siblings and her mother to the grandparents' place because her father had no work and was sent away to a work scheme, probably building a road to nowhere, which was often the sort of work scheme you had in the Great Depression. This happened to many, many, many hard-working people. There was just no work. I'm sure the same, you know, in Britain, whose sort of social history I don't have such a detailed knowledge of, but certainly have of my own countries. But then I also went beyond that to talk about resilience to economic shock, and I do think that what happened on Wall Street and in the city is a case of letting your guard down. And I know there's a political debate to be had about the degree of regulation, but I think that the level of exposure from unregulated, unsupervised behaviour on financial markets not only hurt people in this country and the States, but it then rippled right around the world. And I remember having a meeting in late 2009 with the president of Mozambique, a least developed country, and saying to him, how has the global recession affected you? And he said, well, our big export is aluminium. And he said the price has dropped in half, and so has the demand. And he said the other big element of foreign exchange earnings was from remittances. But most of our workers go to South Africa, and they've been badly hit by the recession. So way away in the least developed country, this rippled. So I do think you know, there needs to be a bigger debate about economic resilience and what sort of protections you put in. And then, as you say, I also talked about resilience in the sense of, you know, governing systems which are sustainable. And in the end, I think that repressive systems aren't sustainable at all. But the process of turning them over, if there's not insight at the top about that, can be very bloody, as we've seen in a series of uprisings, and cause a lot of loss of life, misery, and change people's lives forever. And I think you know, the work we do with countries to try to get transitions which are more peaceful than that is extremely important, and the democratisation process is part of it, and does lead, on average, I was told when I came to UNDP 3 years ago, to an election somewhere in the world every 2 weeks, which we have been involved with, helping with the electoral process one way or another. Now, we're not responsible for the results, but the system should work reasonably well. And thank you for reminding us of rotten boroughs and Old Sarum. And my recollection of English history, which is, of course, part of my own family story, Old Sarum and the rotten boroughs was something we all learnt about before democratisation in this great country. Mark's right to highlight the role of ICT and e-cash in innovation and development these days for cash transfers, and there's many exciting examples of this. The cell phone is prolific in the developing world. The internet, not so much yet, Still, text messaging seems to be the most widespread way of communicating through ICT, but I'm confident that over time the cost of internet access by phone will come down enough for that to be more accessible than it is at the moment. But I saw a program in Haiti when I was there 2-3 weeks ago, where recognising the obvious that Haitians will rebuild their simple homes, but without support, advice and small grants will rebuild them as they were, which is built to fall down, which is not resilience. We've got cracking with a program around self-build, which involves showing people what they need to do, and then the small grant paid electronically can be reimbursed at specified small merchants who must sell you the proper steel for going in the concrete, not the stuff that looked like steel that was made to give way with the least of seismic tremors. So that was quite an interesting way of using that cash. Didn't just hand the money out, said, no, here's the cash, it's for the house, you'll purchase from this one or that one, and they have to then account back to us for the quality of what they sold you. But there's 1,000 such stories you could tell about the use of e-cash at the moment. So that's just some preliminary comments.
Thank you. We'll open out to anybody who'd like to comment to Mark.
I'm Emma Mortier with the Department of Geography. Thinking about this new framework over the next 18 months, I wondered if you could say something about the UN Development Cooperation Forum and how you see the relationship developing between UNDP and the DCF. Is it a competitor, a rival, a friend? Will you absorb it? Will it absorb you? Or will it help perhaps deflect, diffuse forward progress? I don't know. And then the other sort of related question might be, how will UNDP, how is the UNDP reforming its governance given considerable pressures over the legitimacy even of the UN organisations and the multilateral system and the rising voice and claims to power by the rising powers in development action?
Mark would like to bring a seat to the front as well. Well, firstly, the competition, if you like, is not between UNDP and the DCF, the Development Cooperation Forum run by the Economic and Social Council of the UN every 2 years. The competition is between that and what came out of the Busan Aid Effectiveness Conference. And the outcome document said there would be established a global partnership for development cooperation. Now, if I sort of decipher that a bit, decode that a bit, Busan was the fourth and last of the aid effectiveness forums which have been run by the OECD. But of course, the traditional donor countries in the OECD are far from being the only development partners on the block. There are, as we were discussing more at dinner last night, there is a lot of South-South cooperation, and not just from large emerging economies to poorer developing countries, but a lot of exchange across the board at all levels of development. You know, LDCs exchange ideas. Uruguay supported Rwanda with 1 laptop for every child in the schools. There's a lot of this going on. But the aid effectiveness forums have tended to be the traditional partners talking to program countries. Now, the OECD, I guess, seeing the way the wind was blowing, wanted a broader conversation which would bring in the South-South partners, major players, into some kind of dialogue or forum. And so the outcome of the Busan forum for this global partnership can be quite significant if it's able to develop in a conversation with the BRICS and others who are significant. in development cooperation these days. But the position hitherto has been that the Global South rather prefers the Development Cooperation Forum because everybody's there, you know, one state, one voice, the UN, etc. So the DCF is going ahead in July. I've been involved with it once before, 2 years ago. Before that I wasn't at the UN. And I thought that the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, which does the main organising for it, did quite a good job in making it a knowledge-sharing kind of forum. Countries came, presented case studies of what they thought the world should know about and share from, and that was extremely positive. So for the foreseeable future, these two shows will both run, and our role with the Development Cooperation Forum at ECOSOC is to support countries to bring their presentations there. We do a lot of work on that, and often when you see a minister from a developing country presenting, you'll see in the audience the UNDP resident rep or who's also the resident coordinator coming, because a lot of work's been done by the team to support the country's presentation. And we chair a lot of sessions and put substantive input in New York as well. With the Busan Forum and its predecessors and now the new Global Partnership, yes, we are involved as a bridge, if you like, between developing countries and the OECD. And certainly the OECD is looking to us to do a lot of the work again on the ground with the kind of reporting against the various frameworks for development effectiveness, etc. So we're all over it, but very much in the sort of position you'd expect from the UN as a facilitator, a convener, a broker, or trying to bring people together, support developing countries to, put their case in the best way that they can to partners and so on. Oh, and you mentioned governance at UNDP. We have a board of member states elected from the body of member states. And it is true that the weighting on it does not reflect the weighting of membership in the General Assembly. There is a heavier weighting for donor countries. We're probably talking roughly 1/3, 2/3, which clearly isn't the weighting in the UN. Now, traditionally, that would have been justified by the fact that the donors actually financially support us. We get a far smaller flow through from the countries we're working in for obvious reasons. Now, when UN Women was set up, it ended up with a different formulation, a different weighting. But to this time, I haven't heard of any push to revise the weighting on the boards of UNDP, which also covers UNFPA and UNOPS, and the UNICEF board is similarly structured to our own. It may be that G77 plus China will want to revisit that at some point, but it's not seen as an exclusive board. I mean, my experience at the board is that any member state really wants to participate does participate, and then I think the other bigger issue for the UN is how, as an organisation with a member state membership base, it works on the other side of the equation. You start with the words at the beginning of the charter, we the peoples. It doesn't say we the nations or we the member states, it's we the peoples. But how does the UN interact with the peoples, with civil society, with a member state-based organisation? And in a world where there's a not insignificant number of member states who don't allow much license or freedom for civil society. Now, we have a Civil Society Advisory Committee for UNDP. It's a meeting in the next few weeks. And I have written to every UN resident coordinator / resident rep for UNDP in the world and asked them, wherever possible, they must set up a Civil Society Advisory Committee so that they are not only talking to government interlocutors, but are also reaching out to civil society. in an active and structured way. As I say, I am well aware of countries where this is exceedingly difficult, but in many countries it could be done but hasn't been done to date. The Secretary-General also has been, in the second term, looking to revamp the whole partnership operation of the UN proper. He's appointed Bob Orr, who's one of the senior ASGs, to head that office, and I think really wants to reach out a lot more to civil society from the UN organisation as a whole.
I just want to offer one comment, if I may, on the kind of broad topic you're raising there, which is about governance in globally shared institutions. You picked up the DCF as a kind of example of it. And just to be clear, the UK government is in favour of significant further reform across the governance of most of the shared institutions. We want reform of the Security Council. We were strong advocates, for example, in the World Bank of the third seat for the African constituencies. We were strong supporters of quota reform in the IMF. We think that there's more to go, reflecting how the world is changing on this journey. I think there are two useful forces which are going to accelerate this progressive reform, and they're about competition for resources. On the one side, the current financiers, organisations like mine, are very interested in how to spread our resources across the shared institutions in a way to maximise impact on the results we care about. We have last year conducted a review of our financing across 43 major multilateral organisations, which led to our departure from some of them and significant increases in funding for others and agreement on areas of progress in a big block in the middle. There's also a competition at the end of potential users of resources. I was very, which I think is a powerful thing, a helpful thing. I was very struck by the decision taken at the summit of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa in Delhi. Was it 3 weeks ago, to take forward discussions on the establishment of a BRIC bank, an investment bank. Some people in organisations like the World Bank view that as a threat and a problem. I actually think it's a really valuable, powerful opportunity because it will cause the traditional lending organisations, it will give them a stronger incentive to remain relevant and useful and valuable to their clients and borrowers. And that is that's a serious public good, in addition to the valuable things that a new investment bank could do in meeting capital shortages for the development efforts of lots of the poorest countries. So I think competition, as well as, if you like, global political necessity, will contribute to further reform and progress in all these institutions.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Following recent developments in Burma, several governments and the EU itself suggested that the government lift sanctions, and in his recent visit, David Cameron even suggested that the government suspend the sanctions. So my question to Mark and Helen is, what steps does the British government and the UNDP undertaking in order to help Burma in its development?
Okay. Thank you very much. Very timely question. We've had a series of visitors from the top level of the British government to Myanmar over the last 9 months or so. Andrew Mitchell, the Development Secretary, was there a few months ago. William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, went shortly after him. And as you say, David Cameron was there. We do firstly want suspension of the sanction regime, and that's a discussion to be pursued in the EU. We're also building up and broadening our current development efforts. So actually for some years, DFID has had a team of people working in Burma, mostly on social sectors, health and education. The government, when it completed the spending review, setting budgets across UK government departments, including for DFID, 18 months ago, announced a significant increase in the resources potentially available to support progress in Burma, and we do expect to grow our programme quite rapidly now to build on the opportunity that's been created by this moment of reform. We want in particular to broaden our areas of activity beyond the social sectors into helping Burma with modernising its governance and its public administration and those things that will need to be put in place to underpin the kind of rapid growth and development that Burma is certainly capable of achieving.
Well, certainly things are changing in Burma, and that's making it possible for UNDP for the first time to move to a normal country program. Now, if I decode that, among the wide range of developing countries, and we have programs in all of them, I think, except Oman and Qatar, there were two that were singled out for special attention by some of our traditional donors. One was Burma and the other was North Korea. And the UNDP board, accordingly, has had quite strict constraints on what we can do in both countries. And in Burma, it restricted UNDP to what you might call a humanitarian plus level of activity, which frankly can't be very effective because you're never really dealing with the system-wide change and reforms which need to happen. You're fiddling around at the community level. It's very, very frustrating. Now, with the political change which has occurred in Burma, there's clearly a desire from the donor community to see that change. And when Hillary Clinton made her very important statement about US aid resuming an interest in Burma, she specifically said in that statement, and we are supporting UNDP to have a full country program in Burma. So, we're off the leash and working as we speak on what that full country program would look like, because for the first time we will be able to then work with the government authorities, and that's the way that you really can start pushing some systemic change ahead. And I think they will be very much looking to us to help them build their capacity in public administration and governance in every sense, because the quality is quite obviously poor from the experience Burma has had. So we're very positive about that. I just want to come back to another point that Mark made about the competition for resources now in development. Many more actors courting traditional donor source money, and in this day and age, you have to be very clear what your value proposition is when you go to a donor. Now, there's a significant event process at the UN this year, which happens every 3 to 4 years, and it has a ghastly name. It's the Quadrennial Comprehensive Policy Review of the United Nations Development Systems Operational Activities. In other words, they're looking at how we work. And last time the UN did an exercise like this, around 2008, it came up with 17 pages and 148 operative paragraphs. But getting through all that, what we in the UN development system, broader than UNDP, are saying is that this big review should affirm the unique role and relevance of the UN in development. And then we define what that is. And we say it is based on us being organisations in the world's premier multilateral organisation, the United Nations. That gives us a convening power which nobody else has, and a level of trust and confidence in impartiality and being there for development. That is the agenda, and to uphold the body of conventions, international laws, treaties, protocols that have come through the UN system. We are emphasising our universal presence. Sometimes the universal presence may only be UNDP, but the UN development system has a presence everywhere, except, as I say, we are not in Qatar and Oman, but everywhere else. We have, across the whole UN development system, incredible depth and breadth of expertise. You're talking, everything from the International Telecommunications Union and UNESCO to UNICEF and UNDP. I mean, there's just a huge range. And if you can coordinate that expertise in this day and age when countries are facing very complex challenges which are not susceptible to solution by a single ministry, sector or agency, if we have the ability and the support to coordinate what we do, we are an unbeatable proposition. So that's our basic position going into this review. Because there's no God-given right of any UN agency to expect to be funded. We have to continually prove worth and value and impact. And countries are very focused on results now. Developing countries want results, but the donors also want to see results. Now, we have to have, obviously, a sensible discussion about results, because if you're working in this kind of governance area that UNDP's in, as I say, we're not responsible for the quality of the outcome of the election, but we can be held accountable for the quality of what contribution we made to at least making it possible. It's not as easy for us as just counting number of immunisations or children sitting in a school at a school desk. We're dealing with rather broader change and transformational issues, but we're all having to work very hard on results frameworks and reporting so we can demonstrate that we don't just go to the office in the morning, open the paper, have a cup of coffee and think about development, that we actually do contribute to making a difference. Thank you.
Robert, I think we should move on to Robert at this point. We're trying to keep all the time. If you'd like to say some words. So, Robert Wade from the LSE.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to do a bit more than say a few words. I'm going to talk about developing countries in the world economy and in global economic governance. And I know there are many people, including me, who hate PowerPoint, but I'm actually going to use PowerPoint. Okay, I want to begin by making the point. Mark said that we spend too much time talking about negatives. We should give more emphasis to the positives. Well, I'm going to begin with a kind of a negative that I think receives too little attention. And the negative is that the remarkable fact that in the 2 centuries and more since the Industrial Revolution, only 6 non-Western, important to note, non-Western countries have become what we call industrialized countries, have developed the production capability, the structure of the economy that we call industrialized. And they are Japan after the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s, Russia, the Soviet Union, Israel, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and maybe at a stretch you could put Hong Kong in there, but of course Hong Kong was a British colony until quite recently. Notice, for example, not Turkey, not Brazil, not Malaysia, and so on. And there's an interesting question. Why only these countries? These countries all have one thing in common, and that is that they have all had powerful external enemies, such that there was an agreement throughout the society, especially in the elite, that the existence of the state, the existence of the very nation, was at risk. And this, I think, is an important part of the story as to why these, and only these countries, have succeeded in becoming industrialized countries. Others have had industrial success, but they remain semi-industrial countries. However, now to the good news. The good news is that recently, like in the past decade or two, there have been really dramatic improvements in the economic performance of quite a number of developing countries, and one particular index is the fact that in the 10 years from 2000 to 2009, the share of this broad category of developing countries in world GDP rose by a full 10 percentage points, meaning, of course, that developed countries went down by a full 10 percentage points, very much including Europe. Now, it is widely believed, in terms of how this great success story of the past few decades has come about, that a key to the success is this broad process called globalization, or that is making the whole world into an integrated production zone. This is driving a solution to the development problem. And if you think I'm exaggerating, then look at Martin Wolf's important book called Why Globalization Works, especially page 4, where he says that the whole world should move to a situation where no state has more influence over cross-border transactions such as trade, investment. No state in the world has more influence than United States like North Dakota have over transactions across their borders. That would be the ideal world for development. I'm exaggerating a bit what he says, but that's the core message. Now, next one. Okay, so what I want to argue is two main points about some negative trends. First of all, we are in a phase since round about 2000, which I call China-centric globalization, not just globalization as a great big blob, but China-centric globalization. And that this China-centric globalization has very big costs as well as very big benefits. And the second point is that the West, in particular the G7, is pushing back against the translation of developing countries' greater economic weight in the world economy into more influence in global governance. The West pushback is very strong. So next one. I want to elaborate the first point by distinguishing three big phases of globalization, 1950 to 1980 roughly. I call that trade globalization. The important point is that during that time, production was relatively immobile. Goods and services were produced in one country and sold abroad. So it was trade globalization. Then from round about 1980 to 2000, into the second phase of what I call production or corporate globalization. And the key point here is that in this time, production became mobile. Firms moved their operations all around, and in particular, firms in the West moved many operations into developing countries. And here, in this phase, with production mobile, the benefits of globalization become more ambiguous, and in particular, there is a divergence, there may be a divergence of interests between the benefits to consumers in the West of getting cheap manufactured imports and benefits to employees in the West who find themselves displaced from jobs by the cheap imports. So in that sense, the benefits of production globalization, with the world becoming an integrated production zone, as it was not in the first phase, those benefits have became more ambiguous. And then since about 2000, China-centric globalization, CCG, meaning a great concentration of mobile production in China, especially after China joined the WTO in 2001. And two indicators of this: China's share of US goods imports jumped, China's share in total US goods imports jumped from 8% in 2000 to almost 20% in 2010, indicator number one. Indicator number two, China's share of US total imports, not just goods, but total imports from Asia and the Pacific Rim are now about half. Half of American imports from Asia and the Pacific Rim now come from China. And my argument is that the benefits of this phase, China-centric globalization, are even more ambiguous. There are benefits, but there are also bigger costs than in phase 2. Can I have the next slide? So let me talk about the costs, but actually first just let me emphasize, I do recognize that big benefits have come to various parts of the world from China-centric globalization, not least in China itself, and also to commodity exporters in Latin America, in New Zealand, and so on. But the costs, which I think have been rather underappreciated. First of all, the first category of costs, the erosion of manufacturing in the rest of the world as China has become the manufacturing workshop of the world. In the US, in Latin America, and Africa. Why is this erosion of manufacturing in the West, in Latin America, in Africa, why is this serious? Well, for a number of reasons, well set out in the so-called growth laws proposed in the 1960s by Nicholas Kaldor. First of all, manufacturing typically has a faster rate of growth of productivity than other sectors, and its higher rate of productivity growth typically spills over into other sectors, so into agriculture, into some services, for example. So as manufacturing productivity goes up in one economy, so the productivity in other non-manufacturing sectors goes up. And if the manufacturing sector is being eroded, that spillover effect doesn't happen. And secondly, manufacturing wages are typically higher than in non-manufacturing, and the rate of unionization is higher in manufacturing than in non-manufacturing. Of course, in the eyes of many neoclassical economists, higher rate of unionization is a bad thing, not a good thing. But one thing it does do is to put upward pressure on wages, therefore boosting domestic demand, and therefore making the economy less reliant on exports and more reliant on the growth of domestic demand. So it is serious for both the West and for developing countries that the fast growth of manufacturing in China has been eroding manufacturing in many other places. In the US, for example, if you look at categories, a whole lot of categories of high-tech products, aircraft parts, aircraft engines, metal cutting machine tools, you find that there has been an enormous increase in import penetration, that is a reduction in production in these high-tech products within the United States, and much of that increase in imports has come from East Asia and specifically China. In Latin America, Brazil's manufacturing being knocked out. One dramatic example is that most carnival costumes in Brazil are now manufactured in China. Brazilian steel is being knocked out of third country markets by Chinese steel made of iron ore sent from Brazil. And in Africa, this is the best example of all. This is a really shocking example, which was told to me by a student of mine who spent some years living in the capital city of Mali. So around about the late 1990s, carpenters in Mali, in the capital city, who used to have a business making doors for public buildings in the capital city, found themselves outcompeted by Chinese makers of plywood doors who made the doors in China, put them on ships around the Horn of Africa up to Senegal, put them onto trains 1,000 kilometers to the capital of Mali, and they could still land those doors cheaper than the Malian carpenters could make them. So this is one big category of problematic effects from China-centric globalization. The second one is the category of global trade imbalances that has resulted, causing financial fragility, and so on and so on. I won't even pause to go through that argument. I'm sure you know it well. And thirdly, this I think is an underappreciated problem. It's the reduction in the diversity of supply chains. In the 1990s, US imports from East Asia came from a whole range of East Asian countries. They came some, of course, from China, some from Japan, some from Taiwan, Korea, from others, from Malaysia, Thailand. Increasingly over the 2000s, that has become less true because producers in these other East Asian countries are sending their components to China, where they are assembled. China is the central node in the East Asian supply chain, and then from China, the products go to the US and to Europe. And that, I think, poses some dangers in terms of supply, lack of diversity of supply chains, interruption of supply. And it also, of course, poses dangers for the East Asian countries from their dependence upon China. But actually, something interesting, I think, is happening right now, which I propose as a hypothesis, but I haven't seen good evidence for it. But if it is happening, then it is very serious for the future of non-China East Asia. And what is, I think, happening is that China is increasingly switching its sources of supply from suppliers in Southeast Asia to its Chinese producers in West China, because the government is so worried about unrest in West China, where hundreds of millions of people are living at levels of poverty equivalent to those in South Asia. So wages are very cheap in West China, cheaper actually than they are in Southeast Asia. And also by sourcing from factories out in the West, new factories out in the West, producers on the east coast of China save a whole lot of hassles to do with shipping and customs and so on, which they face getting things in from Southeast Asia. Now, if this switch is happening, then it's serious for the producers in the rest of East Asia. It's something, if any of you are looking for research topics, I think this would be a great research topic. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so let me come now to the second. I've talked about some of the problems with China-centric globalization. I'm now coming to the point of whether, as we talked about at a dinner last night, whether it is true that rising multipolarity, economic multipolarity, not guns and rockets multipolarity, is being translated into increased multilateralism in global governance. To what extent is that true? Well, you can see several indicators of that translation, such as, for example, the big obvious one, the expansion of the G7 into the G20 in 1999. Now, 11 of the 19 country members of the G20, remember the EU is a full member of the G20, which is rather strange when you come to think of it. Anyway, 11 of the 19 country members are middle-income countries as distinct from high-income countries. Incidentally, there are no low-income countries in the G20. And when this question came up, what about the representation of low-income countries? Dominic Strauss-Kahn, then the managing director, the sadly departed managing director of the IMF, was attending the G20 meeting in an ex officio capacity, and he said, I, that is the managing director of the IMF, represent the low-income countries, so we needn't worry about the lack of representation because I am here. You can perhaps appreciate why this remark made the Indian representative on the G20 extremely angry. And he said, look, India is the lowest income country of the middle income countries, and therefore India represents the low income countries. And then, of course, after 1999, the G20 was upgraded to heads of government in 2008, and it doesn't stop with the G20. The G20 has expanded the Financial Stability Forum, as it was, to the Financial Stability Board, that change of name signifying the expansion of the Financial Stability Forum to include the whole of the G20, and in a number of other international organizations, both public and private, the G20 countries have come into the central governance forums of the organization. So that's one indicator of this translation from multipolarity to multilateralism happening. The second indicator is the voice reforms of the Bretton Woods organizations in 2010. With much ballyhoo, it was announced that in the World Bank, for example, the category called developing and transitional countries had increased their share of votes from 43 to 47% of the total share, and 47% was, in the headlines, equated with 50%. So it was equated with parity. So now we can say that developing and transitional countries have parity in the World Bank. And so that seems to be another indicator of that translation. Can I have the next one? But there are also some, there are also some contrary indicators. And the first one is that it is a remarkable fact, I think, that if you look across the past several decades, then Asian governments east of India have all punched well below their weight in international organizations. For a time, in the post-war decades, Latin American governments were very influential, but then they came under the grip of the Washington Consensus in the 1980s, 1990s, and they kind of in terms of their influence, they basically followed along what Washington wanted them to say. I know I'm exaggerating, but they basically ceased to be a source of leadership as they were in the post-war decades, certainly since the 1990s. And secondly, in the terms of the G20, basically the G7 continue to run the G20. The G7 hasn't really been eclipsed. And you can see this if you compare the communiques from the G7 meetings and the G20 meetings. The G20 meetings really, they may take on some additional issues, but they don't have anything significantly different to say about core economic issues. And my understanding of the developing country role in the G20 so far, going right back to 1999, has basically been that the developing country representatives have been pretty passive, except when it comes to blocking certain things that they don't want discussed, such as China blocking discussion of its exchange rates and global imbalances. And secondly, in terms of the voice reforms in the Bretton Woods organizations, these voice reforms, actually, when you look at it, amount to much less than the headlines suggested. I've written a great deal about this subject. If anybody wants to know more about the details, I can certainly send you the papers. But I'll just make one or 2 points. One of them is that even after the voice reforms, the US retains the veto on supermajorities, and de facto, the selection of the president requires a supermajority, that is of 85%. US has more than 15%, so if the US doesn't support a candidate, the candidate cannot be made president of the World Bank. So it was clear from when Christine Lagarde became managing director of the IMF that the American, whoever the American was nominated was, it could have been President Obama's dog, he would have been selected as president, provided the US put its 15% on the table in support of President Obama's dog. And similarly, the European Big Four also have a veto if they can agree, whereas, for example, the BRICS, the 5 BRICS, including South Africa, they have well less than 15%, which is what you require to get a supermajority. They have well less than 15%, and so on and so on. So these voice reforms actually amount to much less than the headlines suggested. And the last slide. Okay. So again, this is the negative, on the negative side of this idea of rising developing country influence in global governance. The G20 claims to be strengthening the multilateral system, but I think there is at least some evidence that its existence and its operation is undermining the multilateral system. For example, in the case of the IMF, just 2 examples. One, in the IMF in 2006, a program was initiated to do mutual surveillance of IMF members' economies, including imbalances, financial fragility, and so on and so on. Then in 2009, the G20 announced that the G20 itself was going to do what it called the Mutual Assessment Program, the MAP program, Mutual Assessment Program, of its own members. And when the G20 decided this, then the G20 countries on the IMF basically pulled out of the IMF program. They stopped supporting the IMF program. Why? Because they knew that in the G20 process, that each country could have a much bigger influence over what the assessment found about itself than it could with the IMF's bureaucracy running the assessment. And so they swung away from the IMF and they supported the G20, but the G20 assessment process came up basically with very little. And that was the whole point. That's one example of undermining. The second example of undermining is happening right now, as we speak, this day, tomorrow, and so on. And it concerns UNCTAD, which is in many ways a rather marginal UN development organization. But for decades, it has been the organization which speaks most for developing countries in the UN system. There's a fight going on right now about the mandate of UNCTAD for the next 4 years. And this mandate is to be decided between the 21st and the 26th of April in Doha. I, for one, will be there. And what has been happening in the past few months is that the West has been making, the Western countries, especially the G7, making a very big push in Geneva to get UNCTAD right out of talking about global macro issues, exchange rate issues, capital flows, debt, and so on, and push UNCTAD into issues like democracy, freedom, gender, youth, and various other things, including UNCTAD organization reform, which is certainly very necessary. But the Western representatives, like the Swiss government, have even made a real big point of getting the phrase policy space. When UNCTAD wants to talk about developing countries having more policy space, the Swiss ambassador keeps saying, we don't want UNCTAD talking about policy space. So the latest I heard was that all reference to policy space has been removed from the mandate, which is to be decided in Doha. And the problem is that the G77 is in disarray. The G77 plus China in disarray. It's not really fighting back against this attempt. And one reason is because the dominant G77 countries, including China and India, are now much more connected with the G20. They see that as their forum, and so they're sending their top people to the G20 meetings and not to the UNCTAD meetings. And so this is an example of what I think is a paradoxical result, which is that the G20, meant to strengthen, which is pledged to strengthen the multilateral system, is in some ways at least undermining the multilateral system. So that's a broad context in which we can talk during the rest of the day about developments in the Pacific Rim. Thank you.